The following is a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio. Want the real story behind the sound bites and headlines? Let's find the facts. Remember, it's not a conspiracy theory if it's the truth. You are not paranoid or confused. You just need to know.
Welcome in, everyone. It's time for Need to Know. Kip Keefer with you on TKR. As per usual, we sit down on Mondays and put together the thoughts for the week. And it's such a great vehicle for me. And I appreciate Tony Kurre giving me the opportunity to come to you every week with thoughts and different perspectives on news and events and even sports, whatever is happened to be top of the mind. And this week, it's a pretty easy call for me because I'm recording this on Monday, January the 16th. And this is the day that we commemorate the life of one of the most significant Americans that ever lived. And that is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was actually born on January 15th, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia. And this is the day that we commemorate Dr. King and remember his contributions to society and America. And of course, his advancement of something that's a shameful chapter in American history, the segregation of Black Americans from routine lives and actually movements in the South particularly. But it was, let's not just blemish the South here. By the time that Dr. King came along in the 1950s, again, born in 1929, this was a situation nationwide. It wasn't limited to the South. The severest cases of discrimination and segregation were in the South, but this was a problem that had, really mushroomed from all corners of our country. And the best example of that, the most violence as a result of the civil rights movement in the mid-'60s and the imposition of school integration and busing and a lot of reassignments of where children were going to go to school, the most violence in the country as reaction to that change in society happened in Boston, Massachusetts. So again, I want to clear up, and I think everybody needs to know, particularly people that have not done a lot of thinking or studying of that tumultuous time in our country. There are a lot of misnomers out there that this was strictly a Southern thing, and it's just absolutely not true. But I want to talk about Dr. King today and talk about what his contribution, as it's MLK Day, it's highly appropriate to do so. And I think I have said many times on this program that I am alarmed by the fact that so many Americans are not given a good foundation on history now. It has been de-emphasized in the education system, and there's a purpose for that because they don't want to teach children these days. And when I say they, I'm talking about this insidious left-wing movement that really wants to undermine and destroy everything this country's built on and the foundation that we all share to be Americans. And history in general for America has been completely hijacked and changed largely by the most regrettable situation that resulted from the Jimmy Carter administration successfully adding another department to the federal government. There's been so many, but this one was really devastating. The Department of Education, which started dictating standards and becoming lockstep with radical teachers unions, the teachers and the people that are trying to change curriculums away from the traditional math and the spelling and different things that sciences and history, all of those things that were staples in the school system forever and the education of our children have been undermined now because, and there's a couple of reasons. One, the teachers' unions are so powerful and they're so politically active that it has become the priority of the educators, not the educated, that is emphasized, and that is a bad path to start on. And the other thing the Department of Education has done is, again, to start dictating curriculum, start deciding what subjects your children are going to be taught, or more importantly, not going to be taught. This was a vehicle that was designed basically to take away from state and local jurisdictions really the most fundamental thing that they are supposed to provide, which is the education of our children, and get the federal government's very partisan and very programmed influence and input into the education systems, a place that they just don't belong. The federal government was never, ever intended to educate our children and to create these standards that really drift away from the basics of the subject matter that was traditionally taught. Now the curriculum is America was not a great experiment, not an inspired endeavor by the people who founded it, but now the founders were these evil oppressors from mostly Europe that came and tortured the indigenous people and took away their rights. And of course, the blight of slavery in this nation is something that is continuously emphasized to make the case that the founders of the country were evil oppressors. And it's easy to sell that narrative to people that don't know the entire story of how this country was built and how it was formed and how all of these things came to be. But there are so many different ways to look at the formation of America and the audacious experiment it was to try and prove that a representative republic of the people, by the people, for the people could survive on this earth. And it was a driving force in everything that happened. And there are so many examples of people at the time when the country was founded and the beginning of the terrible, and I use the word blight, and I'm going to continue to use that, of slavery was cast upon this country. The founding fathers, who proved to be unbelievably wise, knew that was a terrible thing that they left unresolved. But Thomas Jefferson said it best, because they had a very fragile group of states that had different interests. And at that time, in the late 1700s, forming the country, writing the Constitution, the language, if you go and read the Constitution, the language is very clear of what the intention of the founders were, that every man is created equal and has the God-given rights to equal opportunities. But at that time, to keep their coalition together, they could not move. They set everything in place for future politicians and future courts to find that particular awful stain on our past, not only illegal, but immoral. And all of that played out. It resulted, unfortunately, in a bloody, terrible conflict between the states that was avoided back in the founding days because, again, the groundwork was set up, but they could not resolve the issue. Thomas Jefferson said it best. It's like slavery is like holding a wolf from behind by his ears. You don't like it. You're not comfortable, but you don't dare let it go. It summarized kind of the feeling at the time that we're going to lay the groundwork where this can be resolved down the line, hopefully sooner than later. But to put this fragile coalition of different interests in different states together it was a move that they had to make originally. It's a lot like politicians arguing, I need another term or I need to go back because my work is unfinished and I cannot achieve my agenda if I'm not in office. And I think you're even going to hear that from our sitting figurehead in chief in the reelection campaign of all the great things that he's going to do for you, but he can't do them unless he's in the Oval Office. But that's been a pattern since the beginnings of our country. And once again, I've done what I'm famous for doing, kind of straying off the path, because I want to talk about Dr. King. And again, I mentioned he was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, the son of at that time, associate pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. His father's name at that time was Michael King, and he was actually married. He was the oldest child. He was named Michael King Jr. It wasn't until years later when Michael King took over as the full-time pastor, Michael King Sr. of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, that he altered his name to honor the great leader of a lot of the Protestant religions, Martin Luther. And that's where that came from. And his son took that same name as Martin Luther King Jr. But young Michael King grew up in Atlanta. His father was somewhat of a taskmaster and stressed not only having the supreme education opportunity, but also theological theory. And Dr. King came up through the ranks. And there's a lot of people that are called Doctor this and Doctor that. First Lady Dr. Jill Biden, for instance. And I cleared my throat sarcastically there. I'm sorry. But Dr. Martin Luther King was the real deal. After graduating from Morehouse College in Atlanta, young Martin Luther went off to seminary education in Pennsylvania at a place called Crozier Theological Seminary, and then got his doctorate degree from Boston University. So he legitimately earned that title, and thereby afterwards was Dr. Martin Luther King. He returned to the South after securing that education and those degrees, and his first job was actually in Montgomery, Alabama at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. At 25 years old, he already had unbelievable skills in terms of his religious teachings and his extraordinary skills in oration. He's one of the greatest speakers this country has ever produced. I would argue a couple of his most notable and famous speeches, which we're going to talk about today, it was not just the wordsmithing, which he was an absolute masterful genius at, but it was also his delivery, his timing, his word inflection. As somebody who has done a lot of public speaking and has done a lot of this kind of communications in my career, what Martin Luther King could do was completely just grip a crowd and electrify an audience. And those are the things that as a speaker, you just stand up and say, wow, this guy was unbelievable. And that initial time in Alabama, that was right at the time in the mid 50s when things were really starting to heat up in terms of Black Americans having had enough of segregation and discrimination and lack of opportunity. And Dr. King got involved with a circle of people that were like-minded, including Dr. Shuttlesworth, who in Birmingham, the airport still bears his name, one of the great civil rights leaders, but also many of the others, Lowry and some of the others that were active in that time. Dr. King became part of that inner circle and started working for really the resolution of what was, of course, reformed by the Civil War and the passage of the 13th and 14th Amendment. But after that period, that happened in 1865. and it was an awful long time. This was getting into close to 50 years, or I'm sorry, 100 years after the passage of those amendments, which put full citizenship rights on many of the freed slaves and other Black Americans that were spread across the country that had gotten away from that. But it really didn't fulfill the promise of full citizenship because of the discrimination and the segregation. And it was just time for that to be addressed and reformed for good. It should have happened many, many years before that, but always was sort of a sleeping giant out there that just needed to be awakened. And Dr. King ended up becoming the primary force in what we see now, that this society has come leaps and bounds forward since his life and times. In 1960, Dr. King returned to Atlanta and became the associate pastor under his father at Ebenezer Baptist Church. His father was aging, and anyway, he went back to Atlanta, but he already had the reputation as a civil rights leader, and it was difficult for him in Georgia because the governor, it was named Vandiver, was not real excited about one of the chief civil rights leaders coming back to Georgia, and really made life difficult for young Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. In fact, he was pulled over and arrested for driving without a license when his Alabama license from the time that he lived in Montgomery was still valid. He had not made the changeover, and I don't know what the time frame was, but it wasn't a ridiculously long period of time. But there were no laws at that time on the books in Georgia about time limits of an expiring license. Basically, if you moved to another state back in 1960, you were permitted to continue to carry your license from that previous state until it expired. But they trumped up some kind of law that basically charged him with driving with no license. And unbelievably, Dr. King was sentenced to 4 months hard labor for something that wasn't really even a violation. It was an absolute outrage, and it immediately caught the attention of a lot of people in the country, including 2 guys that were running for president that year. And their names were John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon. John F. Kennedy was in the party, the Democrats, that were historically always against any kind of equal rights for Black Americans, that stood in the way of full citizenship, who endorsed segregation. There was a strong contingent of Southern senators that this was the number one issue. And the fact that this became a political topic in a presidential election really was a remarkable thing, as Dr. King had begun his sentence. Anyway, it came down to the both candidates having to make comments on that situation. And it was John F. Kennedy who, in consultation with his brother Robert and Bobby Kennedy, was far more tuned in to the struggles of Black Americans, even at that point, and understood how it was a key to possibly winning the presidential election. So John Kennedy reached out to the governor of Georgia, and as the nominee for president in that party, got a concession. I don't know what he had to promise to make it happen, but next thing you know, Dr. King was immediately released. And 2 days later, the repercussion of that was his father endorsed publicly John F. Kennedy for president, which was a startling thing for a Black man in the South who had a strong leadership role and a lot of people coming to his church every Sunday, a religious leader nominating a Democrat at a time where the Democrats were the oppressors and really the people preventing the advancement of Black people. Anyway, a lot of historians will tell you that endorsement probably put Kennedy over the top in one of the closest elections in the history of our country, John F. Kennedy wins the presidency, and it certainly was tremendously aided by the endorsement from Martin Luther King Sr. So the Dr. King story continues. He became really active in the civil rights movement leading up to 1963. All of the horrible images that you see from the different protests and marches throughout predominantly Alabama and Mississippi, including Selma, Montgomery, and here in Birmingham, where the famous footage of Sheriff Bull Connor ordering high-pressure fire hoses and releasing police dogs on protesters were depicted all over the country. And Dr. King, of course, was leading on those different marches. He was arrested early on and placed in jail in Birmingham and wrote a famous document at that time, Letter from Birmingham Jail, which really spelled out in great detail what the moral obligation of this country was to finally let people move forward and not be, isolated and discriminated against and segregated. And he cited in that letter, I'm in jail right now for civil disobedience. But one of the most celebrated events that created this country was the Boston Tea Party, which was the ultimate example of what would be at that time unlawful civil disobedience. And it was a correlation, I think, that a lot of Americans identified with. So Dr. King was eventually bailed out and continued his path, which led that summer to probably his most famous moment when the March on Washington took place. And he stood at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in front of hundreds of thousands of people and gave one of the most famous speeches in American history, the I Have a Dream speech. And in that speech, it was 17 minutes long, but about half of it ended up being not his written text, but his I Have a Dream section, which was sparked by his friend, the famous gospel and blues singer Mahalia Jackson, who was standing behind in a throng of people that were, she was performing some numbers during that show, but he had laid out for her a couple days before his vision of the future. And he said, he kept saying, I have a dream. And she said from behind him as he was talking and the crowd was really getting into it, Martin, tell them about I Have a Dream. And it prompted him to just go completely ad lib and have some of the most famous verbiage that ever's been delivered to a crowd, where Martin Luther King said, I have a dream today that one day this nation will rise up and adhere to the creed of our founding fathers. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal. He went on, of course, the most famous passage of that speech. He had a couple of different references to Alabama and to Mississippi. Mississippi, a sweltering furnace of oppression and discrimination. Someday he dreamed that Black children and Black brothers and sisters would be with their white counterparts sitting at the table of brotherhood. But of course, the most famous passage was, I have a dream today that one day this nation, my 4 little children, will grow up in a land where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Think about those words, because in this time of tumult and turmoil, where everybody that is pushing for the dissolution of our country and what all the principles we stand for have completely gotten away from the message of the most significant civil rights leader in our history, when he said, not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. What could make more sense than that? Why in the world does what someone looks like, their skin tone or their origins or their nationality, none of that matters. And anybody who makes a snap judgment about anyone based on what they look like instead of who they are it's indefensible to me, and I never have understood it. And I pride myself on the fact that everybody that I've ever known, that I've gotten to know and have conversations with, I always use that particular guideline. It's always content of character, because that's what, your determination about other human beings needs to be based on. It's not only logical, it's just the order of things as they should be. And that's the thing that I want everybody to know as we talk about need to know today, that if you find yourself making snap judgments on someone before having a conversation, before making an effort to understand where they're coming from, try to get in touch with the character of people that you encounter, because Dr. King's simple line, not the color of their skin, but the content of their character, is the most profound, simple sentence, I think, in human history. It makes so much sense. It's just the perfect line. And of course, he was lauded for that speech, and it was such a tremendous shot in the arm for what was going to happen, because President Kennedy would be assassinated later that year in Dallas. He was already being pushed by his brother and a lot of his inner circle to write sweeping legislation to change this narrative in our country and address civil rights. And Kennedy was a political animal. He had meetings with Martin Luther King late in his life before that fateful trip to Dallas. And he told him, I am on board. I'm going to get this done, but I can't get it done unless I'm back here in the White House. So we're right back to the theme we started this with. And he begged for his support and patience, because he said, in my second term, I won't have the specter of re-election hanging over my head. I can take steps. I don't care who I alienate. I can put this thing in motion and get it done. So all that was pending when he died that November 22nd day in Dallas. And when Lyndon Johnson, who had been a bit of a segregationist and a Southern Democrat politician, when he came in, speaking of political animals, he was the ultimate one. He adopted so much of that policy because that he knew that was the key to the Democrats now staying in power. So at that point, when LBJ got behind the Kennedy civil rights platform, that really was the beginning of the change to this modern day association between Black Americans and the Democrat Party. But it was insincere when it started, and it's insincere now. And this has gone on for decade after decade after decade. Yes, they sponsored the civil rights program. Yes, they changed America with their participation. And yes, they changed their party, but they have not delivered on the promises. They have not transformed the lives of people that are impoverished and undereducated, and all of the failings of the system to move forward aggressively and make the American dream available to everybody. And Dr. King's speech in Washington that day, he later said in interviews, I have a dream, was rooted in the American dream as its origin. So the job is not finished. The Democrat Party it counts on the votes of Black people. And now for the first time, polling shows that finally this latest generation and people that have been waiting for years and years for this to get to the next level have had enough of the Democrat Party only finding Black people important at election time, and the rest of the time pretty much turning their back and ignoring the situation that needs to be addressed. Every American needs to have access. Every American needs to have opportunity. The American dream must be available to all Americans, or America doesn't succeed. And that is the biggest thing that we need to look at, and the great legacy of Dr. King. Right before his assassination in Memphis on April 4th, 1968, Dr. King was at a Masonic lodge for a dinner and a bit of a rally, and he faithfully said that night and he was delayed getting to Memphis to start with because there was a bomb threat on his plane before they departed from Atlanta. He finally got there, and that night he said that, he fears no man. He says he is, because he has seen, God has shown him the promised land. And he said the night before he was assassinated, I may not get there with you, but I know someday you will see the promised land. He said, I fear no man. I fear nothing. I'm happy. I'm doing God's work. And basically he said, like anybody, I would love a long life. Longevity has its place, but basically said, I know I'm on the edge of something terrible happening, but when I'm gone, carry on. And that's what happened that April 3rd night, not even 24 hours before bullet in Memphis at the Lorraine Motel ended his life. But I wanted to give you some historical perspective on Dr. King on MLK Day. Don't just enjoy the holiday. Think about its origins. One of the greatest Americans, and I'm going to just say it, the greatest orator this country has ever produced. You talk about a guy who could stand up and electrify a crowd, and it's words and inflection and emphasis. He was the best that ever was. And I am a great admirer, and I have always been a great admirer of Dr. King. And I wanted to publicly state that today. It's something you need to know, and do more reading on his life and his times and his contribution. What a remarkable American who is certainly appropriately honored on this day. That's what we got for this week. We will be back next Monday with more on Need to Know. Don't miss Keefer and Kurre later in the week. We're going to tackle another subject of interest. And of course, we've got the starting lineup on Saturday morning, 10:30 on ABC 3340. We always have great stuff for you on that show. Do not miss it. I'm Kip Keefer. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Have a great MLK Day and have a fantastic week.
This has been a special presentation of Tony Kurre Radio.